So polls and polling, right? Polls. Thanks for being here. I'm Lisa Loving, and this is Report the Vote. This is our last workshop in the series, and it's on polls and polling. This whole workshop series is brought to you by the Pacifica Affiliate Network and WNUC LPFM in Detroit and Pacifica. In this workshop, in all these workshops, we cover crucial reporting skills, but this is just one episode in a series. Look for the others online. We're creating them one at a time and posting them at pacificanetwork.org/report the vote news training. Tours. I want to tours of polls. I'm going to freak you guys out. Look, this is my crystal ball. I actually have crystal balls. I love them. I consider this to be part of my spirituality. This is a poll. Polls are crystal balls, y'all. Okay, and I want to give you a tour of my crystal ball, and then we're going to talk about polls. Because believe it or not, this workshop is important because the world of polling has changed. Who knew? How could something like that happen? The world of polling, right? So let me show you this rock, right? My crystal ball. It's pretty. It was not cheap, even though it's essentially just a rock, okay? Quartz, it's made out of smoky quartz, and quartz is known, it's found in proximity to gold. Holes. Gold miners look for quartz deposits, among other things, before they decide to try to find, to dig there. This crystal ball is special because it's got a rainbow inside it. I'm not going to sit here and show you the rainbow, okay? But it's special because it has a special positivity thing, right? Smoky quartz is a special stone because it's supposed to help counter fear, overcome depression, and bring about emotional stability while facilitating positive, practical thinking with clear insights. Holes, okay? I also have a rose quartz one, which is about personal relationships and happiness, and a citrine one. Actually, I really love that one, which is the success stone, the merchant stone, and the money stone. And I bring these out when I feel like I'm struggling in life. Like I have a lot of choices to make. I'm not sure what to do. And they help me focus my thoughts on what I want to achieve, okay? And where I don't want to go. I look at the stone. When you do a stone reading, you're supposed to think of a question. It could be a yes or no question. It could be something more complicated. But the simpler the question is, the better, they say. There's this one woman in the 70s who wrote the book about how to gaze crystal balls, and she's fascinating, and she never allowed anyone to digitize it. Really interesting. It's a really interesting art. I look at the stone and think about a question or decision I have to make. And I might even pull tarot cards and think about the message of the card and the stone and what I should do next in my life. And the thing is, they don't predict the future at all. They're pretty and they feel good in my hands. All right. Polls, political polls, basically answer the question, what do people think? That's the idea of it anyway. What do people think? And with the idea of what are they going to do next? Right? For the purposes of report the vote, we're looking at how polls are used in political elections, but you know that there's plenty of them and they exist in the corporate sector too. Polls and surveys are not the same thing. We can talk about that a little bit later. The thing about polls, though, is that they also raise that unanswered question of what is the institution going to do with the knowledge they just gathered about what people think and what they're going to do next. They can use that information to do something, to build something positive, but plenty of times they take that data and use it to justify what they were already going to do, which is specifically in opposition to what the people in the poll said. This is a very specific thing. I don't know what you technically call it. I guess I would call it bullshit, but when the poll is specific, you see this in local government with town hall meetings, right? The city government was going to have they had a town hall meeting about why the two members of the city government voted to violate the prohibition that they put on more fossil fuel infrastructure construction in our area. The city council had a town hall meeting, like literally 1,000 people came. But what happened? The city council approved more fossil fuel infrastructure after all. right? Well, and this is what they do. And this is really specific. This is a specific thing that I'm talking at the beginning of this workshop for a reason. When you see a poll and the people doing the poll come out and start talking about but, right? That's how you can tell that this is one of those bullshit polls. Probably a lot of the political polls are, honestly. But in other words, when you see somebody doing an entire poll that shows that a majority of people in the United States support the right to abortion, but just the same, your elected official still opposes it because it's against, because, right? That's what I'm talking about. So you can take a poll and you can find out what people want with the idea of what they're going to do next. But the question becomes, what do you do with that information? Right? So I mentioned at the beginning that the world of polling has changed since 2016. There is a sense, and you can do a wide search on this. Definitely the kind of story that's right on the front page and none of us see it at all, right? But there's an idea that in the last two presidential elections, polling to figure out who was going to be elected failed. There's the sense that the industry of political polling is in crisis right now, right? And what does that even look like? I showed you my crystal ball. Anyone who came late missed my crystal ball tour. But really, it's all about money, and it's about who can make money from uncertainty. Honestly, that's what it's really about, right? And it is interesting. I mean, somebody, I'm sure, must have written a book already about what is considered to be the failure of political polls when Donald Trump was elected. And then again, what was considered to be the massive industry-wide failure of political polls when Biden was elected, right? But what it's all boiling down to at this point is that the institutions that are famous for polling, and some institutions are famous for polling, and some are famous for aggregating the polls, but the institutions that are most respected for political polls are scrambling to diversify the way they gather information and bring in more multiple avenues of information. Okay, that's the trend. That's what's happening now. So as you are doing a story about teenage voting patterns in Northern California, okay? Or some other thing like, what do people in your local community actually think about reproductive rights? You're looking at a whole bunch of polls. You're seeing the stories coming in about the polls. What you're going to do is try to figure out by reading that story, how many different avenues of information gathering those pollsters did. That's becoming the gold standard for, is a poll legitimate or not? Did they use a phone and door knocking and people at the health department or whatever, right? Some polls, well, they'll usually tell you how the poll's conducted. Some polls are only telephone, conducted by the telephone. But look for, as you're evaluating whether you believe the results of a poll or not, there's no magic wand or special test that'll tell you whether a poll is accurate or not. That's why the entire industry is in crisis right now, right? And it's in crisis because of politics. I'm just putting that out. So use of multiple polling methods is increasing. There's this great article in the Pew Research, PEW, the Pew Research Institute. Now that's a place that I respect. It's a think tank that I respect, and I think that they use best practices in gathering information. PEW, they talk about society and they talk about media and the use of society in the media. They reported that they're reporting on a study that found last year, 17% of national pollsters used at least 3 different methods to sample or interview people, up from 2% doing that in 2016. Right? So the question becomes, how much information is actually gathered from the polls? And how many different instruments or tools are used to gather them? Those are the yardsticks you're using when you're seeing all these random poll stories, because there's going to be more and more of them the closer we get to election day. And in your local community, they might be some wackadoodle random stuff, especially by the TV stations. I love them. I love the work they do, but they need more journalistic support, the television stations do. Yeah. So here, this is an interesting piece that was in the Washington Post about 2020 presidential polls suffered worst performance in decades, right? I want to read you this paragraph from it because it's just looking at how this is impacting how media outlets do this. You could do a freaking poll. You could do a poll. It doesn't matter how big it is, it's how you do it, okay? I'm reading from the Washington Post. Different polling organizations conduct their surveys in different ways. Survey methodology is undergoing a period of creative ferment. I love that. It's kind of like beer, I guess. Currently, CNN and Fox News conduct polls by telephone using live interviewers. CBS News and Politico field their polls online using opt-in panels. And the Associated Press and Pew Research Center conduct polls online using a panel of respondents recruited offline. You could do something like that. There's even a fourth group of pollsters that combine methods like robocalls and online surveying with opt-in samples. These different approaches have consequences for data quality as well as accuracy in elections. You're keeping in mind that no matter how you do the poll, it's only telling you what that person thinks in that moment. Because it's a crystal ball, right? And it's close to gold. And it might be a crystal ball with a rainbow in it because the people you're trying to motivate, you figured out, want more rainbows, right? And then some of the people think rainbows are evil now. It's super confusing. But yeah, really, we probably just want the information we want to hear, honestly. I have a whole bunch of links for you for these because this is such interesting reading. The real margin of error is often about double what the reported margins of errors are. I just wanted to read that to you too, because that was part of that Washington Post story. There's evidence that when the public is told a candidate is extremely likely to win, some people may be less likely to vote. Well, I want to take a minute on that one. I just want to stay on that for a minute. The real margin of error is double what's reported. And it's shown that when the public is told that a candidate is extremely likely to win, some people may be less likely to vote. It can be literally a voter suppression move. And so as I just was reading, when we talk about staying away from the horse race, this is part of the reason why, because it's a big emotional gauntlet. And people are just as likely to not vote, actually, in some ways, when they take in this information. My sweetheart doesn't vote. We argue about it. Can you imagine Lisa Loving's sweetheart is not a voter, right? He's super sensitive to all the negativity. He doesn't believe, he thinks everything is a lie. It's interesting. Looking at how the drumbeat of who's going to win affects who could win, I want to go back to that. I want to stay on that for a second. In some cases, when we're talking about CNN and Fox News, which are two of the biggest media outlets that I see ruthlessly criticized anymore in support of Donald Trump, right? And they, other issues, Fox News was shown to be controlled by Rupert Murdoch's media empire. And Rupert Murdoch's media empire is known to be criminal. I mean, they're known to be criminal. And that's why those legal cases are happening in England right now with the redheaded prince and all of that. He's suing them for criminality and covering his family. And that's Rupert Murdoch, the guy who just had to pay a few piles of money because his media outlet defamed the voting machine companies, right? That's those people like you. We have how do they call that? Corporate personhood, but you still can't put Fox News in jail. And so as we're talking about polling, I'm just going to look at you and say, these polling reports, the polling reports that say Trump's going to win, I'm linking that to criminality. I'm saying, you don't have to believe me or anything like that. But I think that there's criminal action involved in that. I'm an extreme left winger, and I don't even think that that's a conspiracy. But what I'm saying is, when you're looking at, there's going to be an avalanche of polls, a waterfall of polls. They're already happening, hitting us between now and the first week of November, just mark what views they're putting out, but also try to pay attention to what you think. I'm gonna shift gears for a second. My mother-in-law was a genius. Her name was Sarah Lichtenstein, and she was an expert in decision making. She spent her entire career as a research psychologist. And one of the things I learned from her is that most of the decisions that we all make on the spur of the moment are for short-term gain. Oh, what was the other point? That was the main point. And I was looking at this issue about the margin of error. Oh, we make decisions based on what we want to hear, which goes back to that issue of heuristics that I talked about. And so these polling, the way polling is done by the major organizations, it feeds into those illogical, I'm going to say brain farts that we all have in making important decisions. If I could, I would do an entire 10-part series just on heuristics, because it affects us every day, and it's what we're seeing in the news. In the wackadoodle news, that's scary when we hear people wishing that other people would be dead, in the political sphere. It's interesting to look at the places in this whole structure of reporting on elections, specific places where most misinformation gets in, and polling is one of them. Right? They can be used to shape public opinion. They can be used to mislead people. They can be used to make money. And yet they're also used for valid purposes too. So as you're looking at these polls, you're trying to figure out what polls use the most different ways of talking to people and gathered the most information. Staying with this issue of how are polls constructed, most of the time that polls are trotted out are times of what's called inherent statistical uncertainty. That's a mouthful, right? That's when people pull out polls right when they're super confused about what they should do next, in other words. They're pulled out in times of uncertainty, and yet they're impacted by people's sense of what needs to happen. There's contradictions written inside it. How can it really possibly work? It's part of what I'm saying. And yet we're all affected by what other people think about polls. So, even when people have strong views, a single polling question rarely captures those issues well, right? This is a hard workshop to do, just like the fact-checking workshop, because the bad news is that it is hard to figure out what people think. And even when we know what we think, we might change what we think tomorrow before we vote, right? Polling. There are some small polls that are super useful too, especially if they're looking at super specific groups, Vietnamese mothers impacted by the food stamp policy took this poll, and this is what they said, right? Something super specific. All right. And what time is it? It's 11:19. I have a lot of super specific things to share, but I want to make sure that we have plenty of time, at least 20 minutes, to talk at the end of this hour, because the more I read about what you guys are working on, the more it's possible for me to answer specific questions and sort of put these things together. Because, I mean, this is the last workshop in all of the electoral things, but when I look at them, they fit together like a puzzle, and it is a puzzle trying to figure out how to give voters the information they need to vote, or even how to give people the information they need to decide to register to vote, right? So, and looking at polling, it's a reminder. What am I trying to say? I want to talk about the place in the electoral process where discrimination and problems come in. It's kind of a blanket, really, in this country, a blanket of undemocracy, I would say. But when you're doing election reporting, you don't want to be used by somebody else's political party to put messages in people's minds so that they can benefit from it. You would like to be a fountain of useful information that people can take to decide where they fit in with the policies of these people who are running for office. But it's like there's a difference between the idea that people should rule or people's opinion should be primary, and then the use of polls to determine public policy or manipulate the people's will. It's not the same thing. And I think that a lot of people don't trust polls for that reason, right? It's almost like the third poll is almost like a third rail that drives the policy, but it's not the same thing. And people can use the polls to drive policies that are unpopular in polls. Yeah, the Brookings Institute, which is another think tank, did a wonderful, wonderful essay about what works with polls and what doesn't. There's so much about this. I want to read from that article because I want to talk a little bit about what's good about polls, because you could do a poll, right? And it could be totally legitimate. You would be trying to figure out a piece of information that you know is crucial in your local community, but you don't see the mainstream media talking about it, right? There's so many things like that. So many things like that. I want to, yeah, so many bad things have done about polling, but I wanted to look at what's good about polls. You would have to do your own research on, I bet that there's apps, no kidding, digital apps out there to help a small newsroom do a poll or a survey. Polls usually ask one question, yes or no. A survey usually has multiple choice, that's difference, right? And so you could see if people use them interchangeably. But when you can find a way to identify a specific community of people, right, in your coverage area that you don't think that people are being heard from, it's still worth it to look for polling information coming from those communities. Vet the information, using just those basic yardsticks, like how many people did they talk to? How many ways did they ask the question? And a lot of times, universities are good sources of polling information. They're a little less, they're not part of campaigns. But there are times when you do need to take a temperature, you do need to take a pulse of people. And it's interesting to me because I've talked in previous workshops about these sort of think tanky movements in France and England and in the United States to redefine voting blocks, not based on political party, because honestly, it looks like political party is one of the worst ways to look at people's voting patterns, right? And when you look at it that way, and then you look at some of the polls where you'll see the headline, contradictory poll, people want this, but they don't want that, or they want both of them, but they don't want one of them. When you look at the contradictions, every poll that you read has contradictions in it, and you have to read far down in the story to find out what they are. But that fascinates me too. Like what did the poll make more confusing? But as people, we sort of don't fit into those boxes, right? If you can figure out a way, and there's so many systems that collapsed in our political process over the past, I'm going to say, well, since 2016. And that's not even talking about the 1619 project level of things that don't work in this country. But when you look at how many systems have collapsed, including how we even cast ballots, you are in an interesting position to figure out different ways to report that. And it's going to be your job to do it. Right? So polls, sometimes polls can be small. They don't have to be really big. And it's all about the methodology. Yeah. And yeah. I'm going to take a breath here. Does anybody have any questions yet or concerns? I'll jump in here and say, there are
Lisa, I'm just curious, when you in your work, do you use polls in any way? Is there some way that it helps your reporting? And
sometimes the poll is the story, which is interesting, and you'll see that. But no, were you going to say something else? No.
I guess I'd like you to explain what you just said.
Okay.
But also, I'm also just curious that if you have any models for if I wanted to conduct a poll, how does one actually practically do that? But the first question, I guess I'd like you to explain more about what you just said in my response on how you use polls in your work.
In my work, so sometimes, so I'm going to make a note here though. I'm going to look up polling widgets offline because I bet there are some for newsrooms. It's a science. There's a lot to it. And yet at the same time, it can be really simple. In my own work, I love data, I love numbers, and yet I don't trust them a lot. So let me just take a super specific example. Okay, say I was going to do, I could say I was going to do a story about how here in Portland, we're starting a whole new form of government. It's really exciting. It's wonderful to see. And there's been polls by different political organizations that support the new government or who are against the new government. And they'll come out with these polls that basically they feel proves their point, right? Whatever it may be. And so I might, as a journalist, use I might report on a conservative organization or a liberal organization that did a poll and this is what they found. And I might look at that as, I'm going to look at that as this is what these people that were asked, this is what they thought at that time, right? I'll sit there and I will use my crystal ball to figure out, like, do you think those people are really going to vote? Are all those swing voters going to vote for Biden? I'm just curious about it. So I will look at polls, and honestly, I will look at polls that I disagree with, and I'll look at polls that that I do agree with, and then I'll tell myself I agree with this poll. And it's important that I determine that with myself because I know about cognitive bias. And I know, I hate to say this, but I know that I don't always make the right decisions. So I literally would sit there. I will literally sit there and say, I agree with this. I don't agree with this. I agree with this. I don't agree with this. And then go and look at the methodology and challenge myself. Okay. Because Sarah Lichtenstein was my mother-in-law. That's the real reason.
So you're saying that you use the polls mostly to form your own opinions. You don't report on the polls in any way.
No, I do use the polls to challenge myself to think more critically. But no, what I meant to say and what I want to communicate is that I will use these polls to describe the perspective of an organization. I'll use these polls to describe the agenda of the organization that made the poll, right? I can't remember if the League of Women Voters does polls, but only certain people do them. And I think that sometimes, of course, they're totally useful sometimes. They're totally useful all the time. If we could know what each other thought, actually, that was a Gilligan's Island episode. Do you remember that episode of Gilligan's Island when they ate a fruit or something that made it so that they could all read their minds? We don't want to do that. But the other thing is about polls is that we change our minds too. I'm going to encourage you to think about your own cognition, your own thinking process and decision-making process when you report on polls. They do represent something. Polls represent, no, go ahead.
So what you're saying is that when in your use of polls in your reporting, you use it not only to report on what people have said in the polls, but also in the agendas that the polls are showing based on who's doing them and how they went about doing it. So you also see them as a way of identifying agendas.
I think that's a good idea, a good way of putting it. Who's got a little dog?
Oh, that's Bella. She's here. Sorry.
No, it makes me feel happy to hear that. What is the role of polls? And that's what we're talking about right now. What are they for? Some polls are super useful. And when people talk about the failure of polling in 2016, and I talk about this column, and now it's a website, I guess, 538. It's called 538. The guy that founded that was the only guy who predicted that Donald Trump would win, and he was right. And that's considered to be the failure of polling. So why do we do it? Asking each other what we think about stuff is a natural thing to do. It makes sense. And the other place where it comes into play is that, people take polls, and of course, like I said, surveys too, they're not really the same thing. A lot of times polls are specifically predictive of future action. A survey is more like, I want to know the 5 things that made them vote for Biden, and then in the future, we're going to incorporate those into the ads. They're different. A poll is a little more official, but I mean, ideally, we would want to know what each other thinks. And we've seen government agencies that have done polls too, because they, especially the health department where I live, right? When the health department in Oregon started doing polls about what were people's worries about COVID and stuff like that, I thought it was very legitimate. So now that's not a politicized activity that's designed to determine how somebody's political money is going to be spent. But there was money attached to those, polls. And I think that it really was a poll that the health department did about COVID treatment. It's interesting. I mean, you see them, we're always going to have to use our judgment. I hate that, right? Sometimes I'd rather be told what to do, what to think. But
So how big of a role does polling play in your world as a reporter?
I'd say it's an important role, not because I am a pollster or that I even necessarily believe all of the polls, but a lot of the information that I take in, because I'm a data nerd, comes in the form of polls. And it's possible to compare and contrast them. I'm saying that I think I use polls a lot, but it's not necessarily in the sense of, look, here just came a poll about who's going to vote for Bernie Sanders, right? Not exactly, but I feel like I see the way that other reporters and other media outlets incorporate polls and what they're doing. I saw the most interesting thing about Gaza. It was about somebody did a poll. How do you do that? Of Palestinian people in Gaza about their support. It was a poll about how supported Hamas is. And I didn't take the time to dig down into who did it, but I know that the United Nations funds a whole lot of municipal organizations in Palestine that do stuff like this, sort of intellectual thinky tanky stuff. But this poll, this guy was saying, Netanyahu and Hamas leadership, specifically that guy who's in charge, and I forgot his name, those 2 people are super strongly disliked according to this poll. And so the question was, if there was an election today, what would the Palestinians in Gaza, who would they vote for? What would they vote for? And basically this person was saying, as a result of this poll, these people would not reelect the people who are running Hamas in Gaza. But see, something like that fascinates me. I would need to take the time to look at who was asked, how do you poll people in a war zone? Right? I'm sure that there probably are ways. But so, I do use polls, and I use them in ways that surprise me. And sometimes we're only served certain information in the form of polls like that, like this story. So, I have to say I use them a lot, but I also see them as being tools of manipulation, because they measure what we think and what we think is being manipulated to. So, yeah,
But
I
it doesn't sound like you use them very much for kind of expository information. Like if you're trying to report on what's happening, you're not really using the polls as information to pass on.
You know what? In certain specific places, but not all. And in one area that I definitely use polls and follow polls is in looking at the party demographics of states and the country. Like how many people are registered Republicans, how many people are registered Democrats, and how many people are not registered for any party. In Oregon, we had some people go and start what they call the independent party because they wanted to trick people into ticking their box so that they would get money to be the independent party. But I'm talking about unaligned voters. Now that's a poll. That's a statistic I look at, and that comes from polling, because people are changing. People are changing their views even in real time. And I said this before, to me, that's the most fascinating political story in the United States, is how many people are running away from the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. In Oregon, there's more unaligned voters than there are Republicans. And yet we still are dominated by these right-wing Republican blah, blah, blah elected officials doing whatever. It's interesting, So I have to say, actually, I do use them a lot, although I don't trust them and I see them in strange places. But I don't know if that was a very satisfying answer. I was looking at this. Yeah, it's 11:36 my time. Jump in. We're having a conversation now. Jump in with anything about the election stuff. As I was approaching this project around Report the Vote, it's when I started seeing how big tectonic plates of policy and political forces really they meet. And this is one of the pins that holds them together. Polling, it's a tool of money, right? So yeah. But there was this website, it's called realclearpolling.com. Realclearpolling.com. It's considered to be a conservative website, and it's very 1980s in its design. But dude, this website has every freaking political poll on it, every single one. It's fascinating. And like I had to look up what was the political bent of this organization putting it together because I couldn't tell. And it's interesting because it will show you who the main pollsters are. I don't know if you've heard of the Quinnipiac poll. Super interesting. Now, I totally trust what they do. Quinnipiac University, right? A lot of times they're not doing things for big money payouts. There's certain, the different polling organizations are different. But Real Clear Polling is a fascinating resource because even though they're politically conservative, they seem to be listing every single thing. I strongly encourage you to look at that. And in the way they've set it up for their conservative people, I don't know, you can see that they're making all of the Trump polling victories leap out at you so that they look bigger than they are. So I mean, to me, there's a way to use polling information, poll pushers to show what they don't want you to see. I think that's possible to do as well.
So,
Yeah.
Lisa, when a reporter uses a poll, information from a poll, is there a convention or a legal way that one has to do it in terms of in transparency and credit and like do polls have rights? Like do they have copyrights? Just like if you're using a poll, what do you have to say or do to use it properly?
I love that question. And I love how you bring up copyright law. If you were going, first of all, if you're going to reproduce a whole bunch of anybody's anything, I want to strongly encourage you to call them up and tell them, hey, I'm Lisa, and I'm doing a story about how to cover elections. And I would love to use a part of your training right in the middle, maybe as a sidebar on the page. Could we ever do that, right? Always feel free to call people up because we're being relational. Generally speaking, though, when you're reporting on a poll, you're not plagiarizing their information. If you're lifting whole paragraphs of text, yes, but when most of the time you're going to be using like a graphic chart, right? Like just a chart. So I think those things are technically copyrighted. But copyright doesn't mean that you can't use it. A lot of times copyright means with permission, used with permission. And that just means, like I said, call them up, write them an email, say, we're working on this. People love to be contacted like that. They love it because it means that you're reading what they are doing. But yes, I think it's copyrighted. And yes, I think it's easy to get the rights to reproduce a graph. And as you are finding yourself doing your reporting, you might create a relationship with the people who are generating that information. I used to be really close with the Oregon State economist. Love that guy, right? And I would just call him up and say, hey, I'm going to use your graph. He'd say, sure, right?
So when you use information from a poll, do you have to acknowledge where the information came from?
I don't think you do, but I think you should. Okay. I think that if you could literally, and we see this all the time, national polls said last week that a statewide poll, there's a pollster here in Oregon named DHM or something. He's just Doug. He's just some guy, right? But people will say, a poll of Oregon voters said, and they never credit him. They never credit him, but he doesn't get mad about it. But the thing is, a lot of people don't trust polls. And if you include where it came from and anything about the methodology in one sentence, you'll see you'll see more and more media outlets doing that, especially written outlets. A poll of registered voters in Multnomah County were asked these two questions on the 4th of July. One sentence that gives context about who gave the poll, who took the poll, and anything about it to get your audience's respect for it, because sometimes when you quote polls, people don't trust it, and that is true. Andrea, we see Andrea.
Hi.
Andrea Hudson, Mohawk Magazine. Vox Pop at the Troy Farmers Market. Am I being weird right now? No. Okay.
You're not being weird. You're being wonderful. That's fine.
Andrea did the coolest Vox Pop right before, it was like the Friday before or the Saturday before Biden bowed out of the election. I swear to God, she caught every freaking opinion of who would have not supported him. It was brilliant. That Vox Pop explained what the hell was wrong with that guy's campaign, and it was very well done. Thank you for doing that. A lot of young people.
Yeah, no. It's a fabulous market, great gathering of old people from all walks of life and everything there. You've got it. Thank you to Mohawk Magazine. I wasn't there. It wasn't me. It was a group of other people and other
Edited it down.
But I have to say it was just wonderful, and I'm so glad they did it. I couldn't do it. I'm out of the city right now.
It was really well done, and it can take a group to do that sometimes. I find that difficult editing. But what were you going to ask about? What were you going to say?
Well, what I wanted to say is I so don't trust polls at all, because I think they're all marketed. They're all marketing. It's all propaganda. It's all used and manipulated. And so I do avoid that. But what I thought was interesting is you're talking about giving credit. Are they under copyright? I would imagine that the results that are published have to be copyrighted. And if so, yeah, if you get permission, but I don't know if you're free to use that without.
Not blocks of copy that were written like that, but I think that the information from the poll, unless some polls are actually confidential, right? And you could look for that. But
I mean, like, how do you use? I'm sorry, because my life is a bit nuts out here. I'm in the country for a few days, so I don't even get Wi-Fi all the time. But tell me, how do you actually use that? You say it's only a supposition, isn't it?
I'm trying to, we see stories like this in the paper all the time, right?
Yes.
So, that's not what I wanted. I'm trying to open up the New York Times, but you'll see a story. How do you use it? I mean, well, I would use it in a specific way. I'm specific, and I'm like you, I'm critical, and I'm wondering who's paying for it, right? So I'm gonna include that. And sometimes sometimes the story is the results of the poll, because actually when Bernie Sanders was running against Hillary Clinton, that polling guy did a poll that showed that Hillary Clinton was going to win over Bernie Sanders, and it was a landslide for Bernie Sanders. And so sometimes the poll itself is, and a lot of people quit their membership to Oregon Public Broadcasting behind that, because they're the ones that commissioned the poll. But I made my page go away. But the other thing you were asking, the copyright issue, I see polls most of the time, the political polls that we're talking about, some of them are internal polls. That's a different thing, right? Like, so the RNC is doing a poll of whomever to figure out who's going to vote for whom. But by and large, a poll is like a press release, by and large.
Mm.
So you're going to have to use your spidey sense. But most of the time, you can be looking for, I know that people hate press releases, but press releases have information in them. If you see a release if you see something in the newspaper that says a poll came out from the Pew Research Center that showed that wombats absolutely hate watermelons and it's impacting the presidential race. You can go to the website of who did that poll and you can literally find a press release about it and it'll have a phone number of someone to call. I mean, you might think that, no, I don't want to call people. I just want to sit. I am that person who wants to sit in my cave with my crystal ball and my painting of my dog and just do my thing. But really, these are the people who want to be called. Call
Okay.
these people and have a relationship with them. Yeah.
What I was going to do is we're up here at Siena. Siena does a lot of polling. It's a college in the capital region, and their polls are continually referenced. At least certainly up here, I think it's a nationally available. But I was going to interview them to find out how they do their polls. You know, especially during this time when people are deciding whether or not to even vote.
Right. And Andrea, what we were talking about earlier in this hour is that the industry considers itself to be in a crisis. So this is a good time to talk to them about, have they changed what have they noticed since 2016? Right? I mean, that's really interesting. And we are all hit by polls all the time. It's like being told what we think. We have a love-hate relationship with that. Right? But I think it'd be interesting to find out. Once I was in my one-room apartment and I got a call on the phone from a young woman who was in Kentucky or something like that, and she was giving a Quinnipiac poll about, I don't even remember what, employment. She could hardly pronounce the words, and we ended up chatting on the phone for a long time. She had nothing to do with the poll. She was the person who had to do it, and she would have qualified as being like the poorest person as part of that poll. It was interesting. And she was having to give the poll. How the polls go out is important. How many people they talk to,
And
who they
what
talk to.
questions and how the questions are worded even.
Right. And you could even ask, what's the goal when you're talking to people about a poll? What was your goal with this? It's rarely to find out what people think. I hate to say that, right? It's more often to try to control people.
So can you talk a little bit about how you decide how long a poll is relevant? Like when do polls expire? Like how to go about figuring that out?
That's such an interesting question. That is a great question. Because like I said, a poll is a snapshot of what somebody thinks about a specific thing in a specific time and place. The Troy, New York farmers market, now that wasn't a poll, but it kind of was in a way, because people are just saying, like, what do you think about that? Literally, it was just one question. Maybe it was, do you support Biden? Right? And so now that happened a couple weeks ago, but it happened the day before Biden was kicked out, and everybody wondered what the hell happened. So I think that even next week, that Vox Pop is going to be timely, because people are still going to be wondering. There's still people arguing about who are the Democrats and are they going to win? And I felt like that Vox Pop had it literally addressed that, right? The young people in there that was saying, I feel like I heard people say, well, Biden, he's old, he doesn't represent me. I don't think he even hears me. You know what I'm saying? It was super interesting. So, I mean, it depends on the situation. That's what I'd say. But I'm a person, I have an elephant brain, and I have a memory that just for news things, right? So I'm one of those people. It could be that one thing that's happening in my town is that a couple of jackasses, this is being recorded, a couple of jackasses are on the city council, and they are saying and doing really things that are very contradictory to things that they said when they were elected. And so now they're running for re-election, and people want to know, they're not going to be supported by the same people because they were elected by progressive people. But now these people have shown that they're not progressive, and they're spending their money in other places. And those polls are fascinating me. Right? So that's a time when sometimes a poll will be timely the next time there's an election. I feel like Barack Obama, maybe there was a sense that when he was first elected, he was elected by one constituency of people, but then when he was elected a second time, he was elected by a different constituency of people. So think about what information is in the poll. And then just think if there's a time element or a historic element to what you're doing. So yeah, but it's trapped in amber. Yeah. Polls. Man, this whole thing made me look at how does the electoral college work? Right? The electoral college. I have to read this to you because you probably already know it, but it's probably worth it to have this in here. This was on the USA government website. How does the electoral college process work? After you cast your ballot for president, your vote goes to a statewide tally. In 48 states and Washington, D.C., the winner gets all the electoral votes for that state. Maine and Nebraska assign their electors using a proportional system, very progressive. A candidate needs the vote of at least 270 electors, more than half of all electors, to win the presidential election. In most cases, a projected winner is announced on election night in November after you vote, but the actual electoral college vote takes place in mid-December when the electors meet in their states. When this happened during the Bernie Sanders election, the Bernie Sanders electors really got screwed over by the Democratic Party. It was really interesting. But again, this is an election like no other. And you can see how on that, there's still room in this process for people to hijack what's going to happen, I think. The future's unwritten. Electoral college, like we don't even elect the president directly. These other people we've never met. Well, I know some of them, but it's these other people that we've never met that actually elect the president. It's so interesting.
So do polls usually ask a yes or no question, or do they usually ask open-ended questions?
I think what defines a poll is that it has only one question with a yes or no answer. Am I doing that right? A survey is something that is more nuanced. A survey is an instrument, they call these instruments, that ask more questions. They might be open-ended questions, but a poll, I think, is just yes or no, Joe or Don. I think.
Or it's like a multiple choice question, like it's one question with multiple choice answers.
Right, like the ballot itself. Like
Uh-huh.
the ballot itself.
Mhm.
And I remember when I was growing up, when I was coming up in journalism, polls were always done the same way. There were people standing outside the balloting place. Most of my life, actually, that's how it was done. Amazing to think about that now. People still stand outside the polling place and they just get brushed off and they don't even try. It's interesting.
So as reporters, can we go to the polls? I mean, to the ballot, to voting booths, and are you allowed to poll people at the voting booths?
The laws are different state by state because elections are controlled state by state, not by the federal government. And some have created perimeters around the booths themselves. There's the voting booths themselves, and then there's what's called the polling place, which is often the business, the building that it's in. So I believe that you have to look up the law in the individual states, but even now, I believe that you can stand you have to be a certain distance from the door of the building. I don't think you can be in any proximity to the voting booths themselves at all.
Mhm.
And this is a thing where people monitor voting voter security, right? Because Donald Trump, people who supported Donald Trump were they were accused of intimidation by asking people who they voted for and getting too close to the actual place.
Mhm.
And so it's a state by state thing, check the state, but it's really about proximity to the door of the building, not the actual. And of course, in Oregon, we only have vote by mail.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we've got 5 minutes left, so any last questions, or at least anything last time? I'm pushing a little bit because we actually have to use this machine for something else in 5 minutes, so.
No problem, no problem.
Well, one thing I wanted to say was that on a couple of elections now, I've stood outside the polling place, the building, and talked to people as they came out, asking them how did they feel about the experience of voting and things like that. But that was all, I think now, because many states have changed their rules and regulations. I mean, not even being able to offer water or food to people any longer. No comfort, no communication whatsoever. So I'm not sure that's got to change. That's a dumb thing.
Well, some of those, I feel like all but one or two were put on an injunction by a judge somewhere. A judge threw something on those so that it made it so they couldn't make those laws go into effect for now. But there still are some places, I think, that that activists were not able to get that down. But it's just, Andrea, it just goes back to the thing, like everything we do has got a climate change aspect to it anymore. Everything's kind of hotter and more chaotic.
Well, the joy I have found amongst the people that I've been with has been remarkable.
That's interesting that you would say that. Joy is that's not a word that I've ever heard anyone talk to about and utter in proximity to an election.
Well, I can tell you the last few years, it's been a real pleasure to see people smile and laugh again and relax a little bit. I'm not saying I'm for or against anyone in particular because I'm not a political biased person.
Yeah.
But as a human being, I breathe a little easier, knowing that there's an additional choice.
Right. You know, it fascinates me how much emotion, I pulled these workshops together and these workshops on how to report on the elections. If there's one aspect of our entire electoral process that really smacked me in the face like a great big fish, and it's how much emotion is in it. It's all emotion. And that's how, Donald Trump is able to inspire people. It's that simple. It might not be something I love, but he does it in a way that a lot of these other, like Biden, couldn't do. There's so much emotion about it, and yet we pretend like it's a science. Polling is a place where we're pretending like, there's some aspect that we can control in these elections that's not entirely about the fact that, 1 million people just died in the past 5 years. Who wouldn't have? It's interesting. That's the stereotype of TV reporters. They only care about emotion. But if you can figure out a way to communicate with your audience, with your community about who they are in context and, what's joyful about our lives, that's really the key. And I know we're talking about elections, but that's in general. You guys, I'm so proud of you, and everybody who's maybe going to be watching this as a recording. You guys, you're so strong. You're so powerful. I'm proud of you guys. And so I want to say, please contact me. I never, ever get tired of supporting what you're doing. Whenever you listen or view this workshop, just remember lisaloving33@gmail.com is a nerd about supporting your grassroots project. I love your questions. I love just pumping you guys up. I love brainstorming ideas. And I'm going to say this is going to be the last time I say this. Whatever we have as a society 5 years from now is going to be something that you made. Okay. The big innovations in journalism, they don't happen in the New York Times newsroom. They don't happen in the Washington Post newsroom. They happen in independent newsrooms. Okay. So you guys are strong and you're powerful. And thanks for being with us. I hope to see you guys again, maybe at the Grassroots Radio Conference. I'm Lisa Loving. This is Report the Vote, brought to you by the Association of Pacifica Affiliates and WNUC-LP-FM in Detroit and Pacifica. You guys are amazing.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.